Good evening, and welcome to the very first virtual edition of the National Heritage Lecture. For years, the United States Capitol Historical Society, the White House Historical Association, and the Supreme Court Historical Society have partnered to create an annual marquee program that looks at the intersections of our three branches of government, and we rotate the responsibilities to lead this effort. This year, it's our turn. And this year is particularly special as the National Heritage Lecture serves as the kickoff lecture for Ike Week, during which the Eisenhower Memorial Commission is going to dedicate and open the brand new monument to our 34th president. And I would like to especially thank General Waddell, Ed Perez, and the entire Eisenhower Memorial Commission on behalf of the United States Historical Society for including us in this effort. A great deal of attention has been paid appropriately to Dwight Eisenhower's legacy as a general, as a foreign policy president, but comparatively little focus has been given to his domestic accomplishments, especially in the field of transportation. In 1919, as a relatively young officer, President Eisenhower experienced the over 60-day trek from the Washington Monument to the West Coast. During his service in Europe, he experienced the German Autobahn and saw a modern highway system. Once elected president, Eisenhower determined to work with Congress to build a transportation system that would move goods and people across this vast nation. Most people have an idea that he worked on the interstate highway system, but few know that he also was there for the creation and the really bringing this idea of the St. Lawrence Seaway to life, and the foundation of the Federal Aviation Administration. All happened during his administration, all happened with a partnership with Congress. So tonight, we're going to shed a light on those significant accomplishments and share some of the behind-the-scenes work that Ike did with Congress that are described in his papers that are now available. Before we begin exploring this important legacy with prominent practitioners and a scholar, we are proud to bring you greetings from several members of Congress who feel a particular connection to President Eisenhower and to transportation.
And now we're going to hear from Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas.
Our Memorial Commission. This long-awaited memorial pays tribute to Dwight David Eisenhower's leadership as both the Supreme Allied Commander and the 34th President of the United States, while not only honoring the extraordinary man, but serving as a reminder of all of his accomplishments. One crucial piece of Ike's legacy is his work to establish a transportation system to move both goods and people all across the country. Eisenhower's first experience with coast-to-coast travel began during his time as a mid-career Army officer. He was assigned as an observer to a military experiment the first transcontinental motor convoy. Now that operation served as a road test for military vehicles and was used to identify the challenges in moving troops from one side of the nation to the other on the existing infrastructure. The convoy traveled from Washington, D.C. all the way to San Francisco. While on the expedition, Eisenhower gained insight for the creation of a network of connected roads and bridges. His report to Army leaders focused on the condition of the patchwork of existing roads. And when he was sworn into office in January 1953, President Eisenhower knew the United States needed an effective interstate highway system. The development of such a system would deliver economic growth as well as provide for national defense, an issue of utmost domestic importance. On June 26, 1956, both chambers of Congress approved a conference report on the Federal Aid Highway Act. 3 days later, President Eisenhower signed it into law. This bill was a legislative breakthrough that allowed $26 billion for the construction of a 41,000-mile network of interstate highways. So today, thanks to the vision and dedicated efforts of President Eisenhower, the interstate highway system stretches more than 48,000 miles across our nation and connecting us all together from coast to coast.
And now, Congressman Roger Marshall of Kansas, who represents President Eisenhower's hometown of Abilene.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congressman Roger Marshall, and I represent the Big First District of Kansas, home of our 34th President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower. It's been a great honor to represent the home place of President Eisenhower, Abilene, Kansas, but my relationship to President Eisenhower goes all the way back to grade school when my dad was asked to participate in the honor guard for the funeral procession for President Eisenhower. I remember waking up on a weekday morning and it was rainy outside. I got dressed, put on my Sunday school suit, and was ready to go with my dad. I just assumed our whole family would be going to pay respects to a great American hero. I was very sad when I found out that I was not allowed to go, and my dad said no, I had to go to school that day. But later that summer, on my birthday, my dad asked me what I wanted to do, and I asked if we could go pay our respects in Abilene, Kansas, the final resting place for our great American hero. Ever since that day and that visit to Abilene, Kansas, and that little chapel, I became a patriot and a student of American history. What I remember is reading that when President Eisenhower finished his years in the White House, most experts said, oh, this is the 32nd best president ever. But by most historian accounts today, he's one of the top 5 presidents. When we look back on what he did, his legacy, he was never concerned about the evening news or the poll that was coming out next week or the next election. He had a long-term vision to do what was right for America. Now, all of us recall that President Eisenhower gave us our interstate system, something that is still reaping great rewards for all types of Kansans, especially our farmers and ranchers as we try to get our goods to market. Other things that President Eisenhower did, most people don't recall, but he signed the first civil rights legislation. He got us out of the Korean War. He kept peacetime across America, and many, many other long-term accomplishments. But one thing I'll always remember is that President Eisenhower gave us the phrase for our Pledge of Allegiance, the phrase, under God, one nation under God. President Eisenhower always embodied and lived these Kansas values that we still keep near and dear to our hearts. Again, I'm honored to kick off this Ike Week and just hope everybody has a great time, stay safe, and please take a moment to remember some of the great long-lasting victories that President Eisenhower gave us. Thank you so much, and God bless.
And now we're going to hear from Congressman Ron Estes of Kansas.
President Eisenhower was known as a great statesman, soldier, and world leader. And in my home state, he's known as Kansas' favorite son. He was raised in Abilene, Kansas, a small town that served as a Chisholm Trail's northern point. There he learned the value of hard work, even postponing his higher education to support his siblings. President Eisenhower was proud of the Kansas values and work ethic he brought to the world stage as our nation's leader, saying in 1945, "The proudest thing I can claim is that I'm from Abilene." With his roots firmly planted in America's heartland, Ike went on to defeat the Nazis in World War II, kept America at peace during the Cold War, advanced our nation's civil rights, built our highway infrastructure, and left a lasting legacy that changed the course of history. To this day, Ike continues to inspire generations of Kansans, myself included, with his fierce patriotism and tireless pursuit to better our country. I'm reminded of this every time I leave home to head to Washington, departing from the Dwight D. Eisenhower National Airport in Wichita. As we reflect upon President Eisenhower's legacy, we're reminded that he is the embodiment of the American dream. He came from humble beginnings in a small town in Kansas to become a leader for the world and left it changed for the better.
And now we're going to hear from Congresswoman Sharice Davids of Kansas, who serves on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure.
Hi, I'm Sharice Davids, representative for the Kansas 3rd Congressional District. As a Kansan and a bona fide transportation enthusiast, I want to thank you for inviting me to join you today for your National Heritage Lecture to commemorate President Eisenhower and his incredible work to build our nation's infrastructure. Before serving in Congress, I was a White House Fellow, and I worked at the Department of Transportation in Washington. It was there I learned a lot about the impact of transportation policy on everybody's opportunity to succeed. Now, I serve on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. It's been an incredible honor to work on much needed economic development and investment in our roadways, airports, railways, transit network, and local water infrastructure. The revitalization of our infrastructure is an area where both parties, Republicans and Democrats, can come together and work on much needed policy. It's because the future of our country and both parties can dream big when we're talking about infrastructure. It's something President Eisenhower taught us about. Today, many of us don't even think about the importance of our infrastructure until it stops working. But President Eisenhower had a vision for what our nation's transportation network could look like long before much of it existed. After seeing the German Autobahn for himself in World War II and knowing how poorly our own transportation network back home compared to at the time, he knew America could do better. So when he became president, he got to work with people in both parties. Thanks to his bipartisan leadership, President Eisenhower and Congress worked together to build and modernize our nation's infrastructure for generations to come. And we continue to realize many of the benefits of that work to this day. Our nation's infrastructure, including the interstate highway network, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and even the Federal Aviation Administration, were all made possible because of President Eisenhower's vision and determination. His legacy shows what's possible when we put country over party, and I know that we can do that again and make a difference for future generations. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to join you. And as a Kansan, it's always wonderful to be able to recognize one of our own. My best wishes are with all of you. I hope you continue to have a great event, and stay safe, everyone. Thanks again.
Next, we're going to hear from Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, who serves as chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Roger Wicker. Dwight Eisenhower is known to the American public as the man who won World War II in Europe and was the author of a number of foreign policy successes. I want to thank the Capitol Historical Society for highlighting another important aspect of this great American: his accomplishments in creating a modern transportation infrastructure system, one that benefits our nation more than 6 decades later. Eisenhower was the father of the American interstate highway system and creator of both the Federal Aviation Administration and NASA. His policies helped transform American infrastructure and push American innovation in the air and in space. Ike came back from Germany with a new appreciation for the benefits of a national highway system. Before President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, our nation's roads were poorly maintained and disconnected. They kept Americans isolated and did not reflect the superpower that our nation had become. And before Eisenhower spearheaded the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 and the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, America had no federal agency solely responsible for advancing air transportation or space exploration. As chairman of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, I am distinctly aware of the cascading effects that President Eisenhower's decisions have made on American life. The supremacy of the automobile, the design of our cities and towns, the flow of commerce and trade, the blossoming of commercial air travel, and the paramount importance of safety in all of these systems. Even now, Congress is continuing President Eisenhower's work to connect more Americans with a strong interstate highway system and to improve safety and coordination in our airspace. Legislation like the reauthorization of the FAST Act would provide continued support for the nation's highways. We are also advancing bipartisan discussions to improve passenger aircraft safety in light of recent accidents. And as new modes of transportation emerge, like unmanned aircraft systems and commercial space travel, we will continue working to integrate these new technologies safely. Every one of these advancements is based on the work Dwight Eisenhower started. And as long as Americans continue to travel, innovate, and explore, his legacy will endure.
Thank you so very much, Senator Roberts, Senator Wicker, Congressman Marshall, Congressman Estes, Congresswoman Davids. It really means a lot to us that you took the time to join us this evening. Now I have the privilege to present to you a gentleman with a distinguished career in the federal government and in transportation. The Honorable Ray LaHood served as a Republican congressman from Illinois for 14 years, during which time he was a member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. He had such a great interest in parliamentary procedure and was so well respected that then Representative LaHood was a fixture in the House chamber, where he often presided over some of the most complex debates, including the Clinton impeachment. I would also note that his district included much of the area that was represented originally by Abraham Lincoln during his service in the House. And it was just last year that the Historical Society worked with his son, Darren LaHood, and Congressman Rajamurthy to dedicate the Lincoln Room in the United States Capitol. But in January 2009, Ray LaHood was sworn in as the 16th United States Secretary of Transportation following his nomination by President Obama. A great tribute to his ability to work on the issues and work across party lines. Secretary LaHood changed the way the Department of Transportation viewed its mandate. He shifted the DOT's emphasis from simply highways to a larger discussion of mobility options, from high-speed rail to local transit to biking, even walking. Under LaHood, DOT began talking about smart transportation as an essential ingredient in livable spaces. For the first time, the Department of Transportation, the EPA, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development began to coordinate policy. In the 21st century transportation model shepherded by Secretary LaHood, state and metropolitan leaders would have to come up with their own innovative and cost-effective approaches to transportation problems. Secretary LaHood subsequently became the co-chairman of the infrastructure advocacy group called Building America's Future. And here now is our keynote for the evening, Secretary Ray LaHood.
First, let me offer my congratulations to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for honoring the vision of Dwight Eisenhower and the idea that he really was the instigator, the planner, the father of the interstate system in our country, and also the St. Lawrence Seaway. When I came to Congress in 1995, I served on the Transportation Committee, and we learned very quickly that Eisenhower was the one that had the vision to connect America so that America could move its goods and services around the country in a very efficient way. I also believe Eisenhower had the idea that if there was ever an attack on America, on a major city, that there needed to be roadways that needed to be developed so that people could get out of the cities and out of the harm's way. But as I progressed on the Transportation Committee, I learned very quickly how important the interstate system is to our country, and could have never really been accomplished without Eisenhower's vision and his determination to persuade Congress to pass a bill designating the interstate system, and then working very hard to find a way to fund the construction of roads. Back when I was growing up in Peoria, I remember the beginning of the interstate system through our community of Peoria, and it being constructed and not knowing then how important it would be to the commerce of our community and the ability of people to travel all over America. And without the kind of vision that Eisenhower really offered, it could not have happened. When I had the privilege of serving as Secretary of Transportation for President Obama, I knew how important the interstate system was. And I also knew that the system was created by someone who really had a vision for connecting America. And I think we do elect presidents to carry out a vision. And I think one of Eisenhower's strongest legacies, obviously, is the interstate system. A lot of our federal dollars now go into the interstate system, which was built over 50 years and now connects every part of the continental United States. And without that investment, we would not have the ability to deliver our goods to every place in the country, both urban and rural. And there were, when Eisenhower came up with the concept and there was debate going on in Congress, there were many rural states who said, we're not going to have an interstate running through our communities. But in the end, as the interstate system developed, people recognized that this was a way to really deliver goods, but also to deliver people all over the country. And while we were at DOT, we made huge investments in the interstate system. I took a great deal of interest in the St. Lawrence Seaway. As a matter of fact, I was there with Eisenhower's granddaughter to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Again, a very visionary aspect of our transportation to allow the kind of use of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway to deliver from around the world, again, goods into our country. And so I think Eisenhower's service as one of the great generals during World War II and his ability to really capture the idea that in order to move people, and back in the day when he was a general and commander, The movement of troops was very important, and I think he recognized that in a vast country like the United States, an interstate system was very, very important. I'm proud of the work we did in Congress to enhance the interstate system. I'm proud of the work that we did certainly at the U.S. Department of Transportation to enhance the interstate system. As a matter of fact, the stimulus bill that was passed right at the beginning of President Obama's administration had $48 billion for the Department of Transportation, and the lion's share of that money, $28 billion, went to roads and bridges to keep our interstate in a state of good repair. And very, very, very important. So as we honor Eisenhower's vision for many things, we certainly remember his legacy and his vision for developing the interstate system. I'm proud to have served in Congress on the Transportation Committee to enhance the interstate system and carry out Eisenhower's vision. And I'm very proud to have served as Secretary of Transportation to continue the enhancement and the rebuilding of the interstate system so that we can continue to use it as a form of transportation for commerce all over America.
Thank you very much, Secretary LaHood. It is really so beneficial to hear your perspective as a practitioner. Tonight we have a live panel with two people who are virtually with us. And this is designed to be a conversation between a scholar and a practitioner. And there's an opportunity for you as the audience to enter questions through the Q&A function of this platform. So let me tell you who we have. It's a great story. Tonight's scholar is named Jeff Davis. Mr. Davis is a senior fellow with the Eno Center for Transportation and is also the editor of the Eno Transportation Weekly. His background as a congressional staffer who became a transportation expert enabled him to delve into the Eisenhower papers with a keen eye for the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that it took to create the transportation system we rely on today. Jeff came to Washington in 1988 to attend the American University, and he soon began working on Capitol Hill for the ranking minority member of the House Rules Committee. For 6 years, he worked on a wide variety of legislative, budget, oversight, and parliament procedure issues. In January of 1996, he joined a transportation consulting firm, worked extensively on the FAA, Amtrak, surface transportation reauthorization laws, and many appropriations bills. He founded his own research and consulting business in June 1998 and published Transportation Weekly, which was a news service covering transportation and public works until he joined the Eno Center in January of 2015. His work focuses on the analysis of the federal transportation budget and the long-term trends in transportation funding and policy. Before he does his presentation, I want to introduce to you the practitioner that we have because he is also very special. Our practitioner tonight is the former FAA Administrator Michael Huerta. And the Honorable Michael Huerta was sworn in as the FAA Administrator on January 9th, 2013, after having been confirmed by the Senate on January 1st. Earlier in 2010, the United States Senate had already confirmed him as the Deputy Administrator, which allowed him to serve a short time as acting administrator while he was awaiting his confirmation for the 5-year term he was appointed for. He was nominated by President Obama in both cases. Prior to his appointment, he ran his own consulting firm, advising clients on transportation policy, technology, and financing. He served as a member of President Obama's transition team for the Department of Transportation. He had also been president of the Transportation Solutions Group of Affiliated Computer Services, a technology service provider supporting transportation agencies nationwide. Huerta served in 2 senior positions in the Department of Transportation under President Clinton from 93 to 98. He is degreed from Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and the University of California at Riverside. He is now doing continuing consulting, serving on the boards of several transportation-related agencies, including Delta Airlines. So this will be a fascinating panel. We will start tonight with Mr. Davis's presentation about what he learned in the Eisenhower papers about the negotiations to create a way to move goods and people. And then we will turn to Mr. Huerta, who will reflect on his experience running the FAA and how that got created, including a little perspective on the airline crash that inspired very quick movement by Congress. And then we turn to questions. I have a couple of leading questions, and you can join in the Q&A activities. That being said, Jeff, what did you learn in those papers?
I learned that the Eisenhower Library Research Room closes for an hour for lunch every day. So you only get 7 hours a day with the papers instead of 8. But basically, yeah, I learned a lot of things. I've been going through these 8,000 or so pages that I took copies of in 2016 for the last 4 years, trying to come up with some conclusions. And I've put together a piece here that's not going to step too much on what Mr. Huerta is going to say in a second. But basically, President Eisenhower's strategy, wait a second here, screen sharing. Yep, all right, I think I'm screen sharing.
Yeah.
Eisenhower's strategy for the day he took office, starting then, can be summed up in this order. First, organize. He organized his White House in a new way, most of which is still in use today. He created the Office of Staff Secretary to control the flow of paper. He controlled for the Cabinet Secretary to organize the agenda for the Friday cabinet meetings. He authorized a beefed up 8-man legislative liaison office to organize the Tuesday morning meetings with Republican congressional leaders and Saturday meetings with the legislative liaisons at the various cabinet agencies. And he created an Office of Chief of Staff, Governor Sherman Adams, to act as a gatekeeper and make sure that no one went around that staff structure. Then he prioritized. When he took office in '53, the #1 priorities for that year were going to be to end the Korean War and to fulfill the promises made in the 1952 Republican platform. Everything else was going to be studied extensively so they could come up with a new agenda in fall after the Congress left for the 1954 session, and then they would act. However, his first transportation achievement didn't fit this schedule, which is why we start the discussion actually with the St. Lawrence Seaway. This had been discussed, a way to bridge that, not bridge, but to connect and go get around that 283-foot drop between Lake Ontario and the Atlantic Ocean had been discussed since the 1890s and seriously contemplated since President Wilson. You can see the 1921 map there. But for a variety of reasons, it never got built. Not just skepticism of the cost, but because without a seaway, the only way to get goods and commodities to and from the industrial Midwest in Europe was by a combination of railroad and an East Coast or Gulf Coast port. So naturally, all the legislators from the port states and all the legislators who were tight with the railroads were completely opposed to taxpayers building competition for them. The Seaway cut across federal policy areas. It wasn't just economic policy, it was energy policy, because part of the last plan was a hydropower dam between Ontario and New York State. It was defense policy. All the way back in 1946, when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, Eisenhower had publicly supported the Seaway as being vital to shorten the supply lines to our troops in Europe. And it was foreign policy, because by 1953, the Canadian government was telling people it was the #1 foreign policy priority they had vis-a-vis their relationship with the United States. And it got urgent, which is why it went to the front of the list in 1953, because in December 1951, Canada passed a law saying they were going to build it themselves at their own expense if the U.S. refused to participate. And if Canada did that, then they could charge higher tolls to U.S. vessels than their own vessels and create a disadvantage for the U.S. merchant marine. And also, in the weird hypothetical of a war, the U.S. was belligerent and Canada wasn't, we might lose access to the Seaway. So in early 1953, President Eisenhower ordered a very quick study of cabinet views, and you can see the one pager here in my presentation. On March 27th, they had a cabinet meeting, and they decided that they were going to support the Seaway bill. But 3 days later, they had the meeting with the Republican congressional leaders, who convinced Eisenhower to slow down and not make public support for the bill at that time. So they did so. Eisenhower told the cabinet they were going to wait until some hearings had taken place that would demonstrate to the public how valuable the Seaway was, and then he would endorse the bill, which he did on April 23rd. However, at that time of the Congress usually adjourned for the year in July and didn't come back. And as they got closer to the adjournment date, Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that he allowed other priorities that were in the original platform to take priority, and the Seaway bill remained undone when they adjourned for the year August 3rd, 1953. Eisenhower then took a state visit to Ottawa in November of that year, where he got an earful from the Prime Minister about just how important the Seaway was. So when Congress came back for the 1954 session, it was #1 on the priority list. Eisenhower gave it a strong endorsement in the State of the Union address. He worked with the Senate Majority Leader to make it the first bill on the Senate floor, January 12th. After 8 days, it got a tremendous bipartisan vote. It wasn't huge, it was 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats, and 1 independent in favor. It went to the House, where the railroad opposition and port opposition was much stronger. They had to get to the Public Works Committee first to approve the bill, and then they had to get the Rules Committee, which was independent power system in those days. But finally, on May 6th, they got another pretty good sized bipartisan vote in the House. 134 Republicans, 96 Democrats, 1 independent in favor of it. He signed the Seaway bill into law on May 13th, and it managed to get completed in his term of office. When in June of '59, he went to, as you can see the picture there, with young Queen Elizabeth to attend the dedication. And it has carried, I think, 2.5 billion tons of cargo since then. Moving to the project for which he's better known, you've heard several people already discuss his miserable experience in 1919, making 50 miles a day for 62 days over unimproved dirt roads to get from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. By the time he was doing his pre-presidential transition, when he was still living in New York, he met with a Wall Street acquaintance in December of 1952 and talked about the need for a national system of roads. So Eisenhower had been in office 16 days when his friend Walter Buckner came back and gave him the results of the study for a 10,000-mile system of national toll roads, which he'd drawn on a gas station map you can see here that I found in the library. Eisenhower then turned around and gave that to his staffer, Gabriel Haug, and said, "I'm personally convinced that in a number of fields, we're going to have to come forward at a reasonably early date with a constructive program," unquote, to meet national growth in a variety of areas, including highways, because there were thousands of automobiles being added each year and the roads weren't keeping pace. He ordered it studied. However, they had too many studies. The Commerce Department came in with one that wanted to get rid of the existing federal aid program and just focus on interstates. The Bureau of Public Roads had only been a part of the Commerce Department for about 4 years. They had their own separate plan trying to go around the secretary. Chief of Staff Sherman Adams brought in legendary New York builder Robert Moses to write a bill. The Council of Economic Advisors was working with Eisenhower's friend Walter Buckner on a 4th bill. And there was this bipartisan Kestenbaum Commission that Eisenhower reported that was trying to study and reinvent all federal grant programs to states, not just highways. So by the time 1954 came around, there was no consensus, and Eisenhower decided to do something that was very unusual for him. He stirred the pot in an extraordinarily public way. The National Governors Conference was meeting in July 1954 in upstate New York, and Eisenhower wrote a speech on highways to deliver. He had a family funeral, so Nixon wound up going to deliver the speech, and it called for, quote, $5 billion per year for 10 years, in addition to all current normal expenditures. When we will have spent $50 billion in 10 years, we shall only have made a good start on the highways the country will need, unquote. Now, $50 billion was a jaw-dropping amount of money at that time. In the fiscal year that had just ended, the entire federal budget only spent $71 billion. Even $5 billion a year was going to be about 1.3% of gross domestic product. That would be $275 billion, same percentage per year of today's gross domestic product. It's an astounding number, so it's no wonder that the $50 billion plan made front page headlines around the country in the New York Times headline you can see there. Well, one problem, didn't have a plan. Eisenhower comes to his press conference 2 days later and says, quote, "I have no definite plan," unquote, because we've been studying it. But now that it had gained all this extra press attention, he appointed 2 more study committees, one outside government, one inside. For the outside one, he turned to Roger Keyes, who had been Deputy Secretary of Transportation until recently, and was then with General Motors. He was the guy in charge of trying to convince cities to tear up their streetcars and put in buses instead. Keyes turned down the job because of a conflict of interest. So Eisenhower turned to his good friend and wartime subordinate, General Lucius Clay, and 4 other respective men outside government. There was also an inside committee chaired by the Commerce Secretary, which wound up not having much to do because Clay really didn't want to hear any advice from anybody. The Clay Committee made a couple of decisions that stuck. They rejected the idea of toll roads. Instead of selecting their own routes, like Buckner and some of the White House staffers wanted, they decided to go with the 37,700-mile interstate map you can see there that was negotiated by the states in 1947 and use that as the focus of the federal role. And they accepted the Public Road Bureau's cost estimate of $27 billion for that interstate system, plus a total of $101 billion for all federal, state, local road needs over 10 years. When they were delivered their report, and that's Eisenhower's copy there, in January of 1955, they decided to create a federal highway corporation, sort of off the federal budget, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, to issue $20 billion in bonds that were outside the federal debt limit, plus $5 billion in appropriations would pay 93% of interstate construction over 10 years, but the bonds would be repaid by federal appropriations, and they would keep the current highway program going underneath that. There was a bad lineup in the Senate. The Democrats had taken control of Congress in the 54 elections. The chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Harry Byrd, his biographer wrote that he had, quote, an almost pathological fear of debt, unquote. As people tried to tell Chairman Clay when he was coming up with this plan, Byrd refused to do anything relating to building corporations to use federal bonding or any otherwise increase in federal debt. The Senate Public Works Committee put out a bill that had 5 years of interstate funding, about $8 billion, but nothing long-term and no tax increases. The Senate killed the president's plan, 31 votes to 60 votes, and then passed the Gore bill, the Public Works bill, by voice. But it went to the House, where the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, made a strange decision to let the Public Works Committee, not the Ways and Means Committee, write its own taxes. Normally that never happened. They came up with a tax plan that would support $24 billion for the interstates over 13 years, all taxes in the general fund, mostly on the trucking industry, which naturally rebelled at that. So then it went to the House floor in July 1955. First, the House votes down the president's plan, only got 193 votes. And then it defeated the Democratic Public Works plan, which only got 123 votes. They adjourned in chaos for the year. Nobody was happy, and they had to regroup. In fall 1955, the White House did regroup. By December, they'd come up with a one-page summary of a new bill they wanted to submit. They were no more corporation, no more bonds, raise taxes enough to get $25 billion for the interstates at a 90% federal share for 12 years, do it on a pay-as-you-build basis so it wouldn't cause annual deficits, and then continue the ongoing federal highway program. They were in the process of turning those bullet points into a bill to be submitted in January when they met with congressional leaders in mid-December, and they convinced Eisenhower not to put out a specific proposal, and instead to use what historian Fred Greenstein called the hidden hand that characterized so many of Eisenhower's moves, and that Eisenhower would lead from behind without showing his proposals at first. So in his State of the Union, he only called for, quote, adequate finance provisions, unquote. And he left it to his Treasury Secretary to negotiate personally with the Ways and Means Chairman to segregate all these highway taxes into a highway trust fund so that legislators who voted for this, the new taxes, could be certain that the taxes were going to be devoted only to highways. And he worked with the Senate Finance Chairman, his good friend Harry, to add a pay-as-you-build anti-deficit provision in the Finance Committee. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Commerce and Bureau of Public Roads worked with the Public Works Chairman on the funding formulas. And the result was that the House and Senate passed bills in April and May 56 that were broadly similar to that bullet point outline that the White House had but never released in December of the previous year. They went into the House-Senate conference, and the president and the leaders suggested 5 priorities for the House-Senate Conference Committee that are listed here. And they got wins on items 2, 3, and 4, split the baby on item 1, and lost item 5, which was Davis-Bacon, which they were always going to lose. And then the president signed the bill into law in June 1956. Sadly, there's no photos of the bill signing because he was in the hospital at Walter Reed for intestinal surgery, and he signed it alone by himself in the room without anybody around. But it wasn't the end of the story, because that anti-deficit provision that he had included Congress, there was a short recession in 1958 that was very sharp. And so Congress really wanted to increase highway spending to fight, as a stimulus, to fight the recession. Eisenhower got talked into signing the bill, but said at the time to his cabinet that he would request the gas tax increase to pay for all that spending once the economy got better. The economy got better. He requested a 1.5-cent gallon gas tax increase on top of the previous year of the 1956 1% in his January 1959 budget. It was pronounced dead on arrival by Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn. It only got 33 votes in the Senate on June 25th, but Eisenhower responded by basically starving state highway bureaus into submission. That anti-deficit provision, the Byrd test, required him to cut off all new interstate funding for the states on July 1st. And then to prevent the Highway Trust Fund from running out of money, he then said to states, we're also going to cut off all your new contracts on the regular program and stop paying your invoices this fall unless we can get new taxes to keep the trust fund from going into deficit. And eventually the governors convinced their legislators in Congress to accept that. And rather than throw the federal budget out of balance, and Eisenhower got a 1-cent gas tax increase for about 21 months out of a grudging Congress in September 1959 that wound up being made permanent by President Kennedy in 1961. And so that is how the short form of how President Eisenhower got the St. Lawrence Seaway and the interstate highway system over the finish line. I've published a lot of documents from the library through articles on transportation mode at enotrans.org/Ike, which anyone can go view. And now, Mr. Huerta.
Great.
We'll stop.
And thanks, Jeff, also for all of your research on the aviation side as well. Well, as has been talked about, President Eisenhower is well known for his vision and his leadership in creating the interstate highway system. What's not as well known is President Eisenhower's role in shaping our national aviation system. But it was in fact under his leadership that the structure and framework of today's federal role in aviation first took shape. A little background: at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, the jet age was just dawning. Boeing had begun development of its Dash 80 prototype jet, which was a 4-engine aircraft that was designed to demonstrate the advantages of jet propulsion for commercial aviation. The prototype, the precursor to the Boeing 707 airliner, flew for the first time in July 1954. It was apparent that aviation was poised for significant growth in the years ahead. The question was whether the federal government was ready for it. In the 1950s, federal oversight and regulation of aviation was quite fragmented. The Civil Aeronautics Authority, a division of the Department of Commerce, had responsibility for airport development grants, for enforcement of safety regulations, and air traffic control, but only for civilian airspace. The Department of Defense was responsible for controlling designated military airspace. Moreover, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy each had extensive aviation operations. The Civil Aeronautics Board, an independent agency, was responsible for economic and safety regulation, as well as investigation of accidents. The technology was also quite rudimentary. Large swaths of the nation's airspace lacked surveillance systems, meaning that aircraft could not be tracked. Pilots were supposed to stay on designated routes and to look out for other aircraft. Early in 1956, following up on a larger review that Eisenhower commissioned on the organization of the federal government, the administration commissioned a study on future demand for air traffic control services and airport infrastructure. It was important for them to get ahead of the expected level of growth. Traffic was projected to more than double over the next 20 years. While the study on the future of aviation was ongoing, an event on June 30th, 1956, brought into sharp focus the problems that needed to be solved. On that day, United Airlines Flight 718, a Douglas DC-7 bound from Los Angeles to Chicago, collided mid-air over the Grand Canyon with TWA Flight 2, a Lockheed Super Constellation en route from Los Angeles to Kansas City. 128 people lost their lives. At the time, that was the greatest loss of life in an aviation accident. The collision took place in uncontrolled airspace, where it was the pilot's own responsibility to maintain separation to C and to BC. This highlighted the limited state of air traffic control. At the time, it was fairly common for cross-country flights to divert for sightseeing if time allowed. And the area of the Grand Canyon where the crash occurred is a spectacularly beautiful area at the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado. The water from the Little Colorado is a distinct aquamarine blue due to the mineral content of the water. And against the backdrop of the high canyon walls, it is really an incredible sight. So it would have not been at all surprising that the flight crews would have wanted to provide their passengers with a more scenic view of the area. But there were big gaps in the system. Air traffic surveillance technology was non-existent in this remote area. There were clouds in the vicinity at the time of the crash. Both aircraft had deviated from their planned routes and were not advised of other traffic in the area. This was not required since both were flying in uncontrolled airspace. And there were no systems on board either aircraft to detect other aircraft nearby. The subsequent investigation of the crash was conducted by the Civil Aeronautics Board, and the report of the investigation concluded that the probable cause of this mid-air collision was that the pilots did not see each other in time to avoid the collision. The report went on to say, it's not possible to determine why the pilots did not see each other, but the evidence suggests that it resulted from any one or a combination of the following factors: intervening clouds reducing time for visual separation, visual limitations due to cockpit visibility, preoccupation with normal cockpit duties, preoccupation with matters unrelated to cockpit duties, such as attempting to provide the passengers with a more scenic view of the Grand Canyon area, physiological limits to human vision, reducing the time opportunity to see and avoid the other aircraft, or insufficiency of en route traffic advisory information due to the inadequate air traffic facilities and lack of personnel in air traffic control. Well, following the Grand Canyon crash, President Eisenhower and his administration accelerated their ongoing study of long-term aviation needs. In April 1957, they proposed the creation of an independent Airways Modernization Board to sort out responsibilities between the Departments of Defense and Commerce, and to develop a long-term plan to modernize the system and to deploy the needed technologies. The proposal was passed by Congress in July of that year. As the work of the Airways Modernization Board got underway, the administration concluded its more comprehensive review of the needs of the aviation system. The review concluded that projected demand required a modern, radar-based air traffic control system to be deployed. And further, the administration called for an independent federal aviation agency into which are consolidated all the essential management functions necessary to support the common needs of the military and civil aviation in the United States. Now, at the time, there was not universal agreement on how best to sort out responsibilities between the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce. But fate again intervened to force a resolution. On April 21st, 1958, United Airlines Flight 73 was flying on Airways, meaning that it was where it was supposed to be, from Los Angeles to Denver. The flight collided with an F-100 Sabre fighter jet near Las Vegas, Nevada. 49 people lost their lives. A month later, on May 20th, Capital Airlines Flight 300, flying from Pittsburgh to Baltimore, collided midair with a U.S. Air Force jet trainer on a proficiency flight in the skies over Brunswick, Maryland. All 11 people on Flight 300 died, along with one of the two pilots on board the T-33. In both instances, poor coordination between military and civilian air traffic operations was identified as the likely cause. Well, the day after the Maryland crash on May 21st, 1958, Senator Mike Monroney of Oklahoma and Representative Orrin Harris of Arkansas introduced the Federal Aviation Act. Just weeks later, the Eisenhower administration provided a detailed message on what should be included in the legislation. And by late June, the proposed legislation had been amended to be largely in line with the administration's proposal. The bill was passed by Congress and signed by President Eisenhower on August 23rd, 1958. The administration's point person on the legislation was a retired Air Force Lieutenant General named Elwood Richard Quesada. Everyone knew him as Pete. He had been tasked with turning the work of the administration's aviation studies and the Airways Modernization Board into workable actions. He proved to be quite adept at working with Congress, and it was his testimony and detailed recommendations that were incorporated by Congress into the final legislation. Following the signing of the Federal Aviation Act, President Eisenhower named Pete Quesada as the first Federal Aviation Administrator. Now, when President Eisenhower set out to address the nation's aviation needs and to plan for the anticipated growth of this relatively new mode of transportation, he wanted to ensure that it had the infrastructure it needed, both in the air and on the ground. Second, he wanted to clean up a patchwork of confusing and sometimes conflicting government responsibilities and authorities. And third, he wanted to build a durable and adaptable regulatory framework for the industry to operate within. All three of these objectives were designed to ensure that aviation safety would be paramount. Well, 62 years have gone by since the passage of the Federal Aviation Act, and I think we can say that President Eisenhower did a great job. But it was not just him. While he exercised leadership, he was a collaborator. He and his team worked closely with Congress to lay the groundwork for an industry that has grown to represent a huge contribution to our national economy, millions and millions of jobs, and our largest export industry. But if President Eisenhower was still with us, I don't think he would be resting on his laurels. I think he would probably be looking at the challenges ahead for aviation. Concepts like unmanned aircraft package deliveries and advanced air mobility certainly would have excited him. During his administration, he had to deal with the dawn of the jet age. Today, he would be very interested in the new eVTOL aircraft being developed and certified. And he would probably be driving current FAA leadership out of their minds, challenging them with questions about how are we going to deal with all these issues? Who are the experts we need to consult? How can we improve safety? And how are we going to pay for all of this? So while we can credit President Eisenhower with creating a strong foundation, he would be the first to urge us today to think outside the box for the next big evolution in aviation to ensure that the structures are in place and the appropriate resources are available to support this dynamic industry. Those of us in the industry today can thank him for his foresight and his leadership, but we also need to accept his challenge to confront the future. We need to do the hard work needed to make things better for future generations.
Wow. Between the two of you, we have so much information, and it is really a joy. We have a pile of questions coming in from our listeners, and so let's try to do this, sort of quick answers if that's possible. And really, I think both of you really did the research, but you also spoke from your experience. And so one of the questions, which really ties to where you were, Michael, about how are things paid for, is if Eisenhower was here now, what do you think he would say about the best way that we should pay for our transportation system now? Use your imagination for each of you.
He would be aghast at the general level of deficits and debt that have become customary in Washington. Remember that he threatened to suspend indefinitely the interstate program that he had just authorized to try and force Congress to knuckle under and accept enough tax increases to actually pay for the construction as it was ongoing. So the things that we've seen in the last 10 or 12 years of just continuing to borrow money to keep the highway trust fund solvent rather than either increase taxes or cut spending down where those levels matched would almost certainly appall him, because it was a traditional Republican of his time preferring balanced budgets to deficits in all but the harshest of emergencies. He would want people to actually pay for what they were getting instead of borrow in the bond market.
And I think on the aviation side, it's a little bit in some respects the worst, or the reverse. He was a big supporter of user fees. And I think he would be appalled that the Aviation Trust Fund went for many years building up these huge surpluses, which were not spent on aviation, that were being instead kept in the bank, if you will, and being used to offset deficits in other parts of the federal budget. So, I would think that there would have been, a sense of fairness if these fees and taxes are being collected for the benefit of the aviation system. They should be invested in the aviation system.
Fascinating. Now, here's a rumor. Answer the sort of urban legend. One of our listeners said he'd always heard that some portion of the interstate highway was supposed to provide straight roads so that in case a plane had to land quickly, it could land on the highway. Is that true or not true? And has it ever happened?
That was never a part of any kind of design specification. It's actually, ancient Greek good old Euclid about the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line is much more of the reason why there are these long straight stretches of interstates, because it's cheaper to build that than to build curves, all of the things being equal. So no, even though there are some spots where it's straight enough for a plane to land. One did in my hometown of Knoxville on interstate last week, but that was never a design specification, no.
All right, one other question, Michael, for you. When we developed the FAA in this country, were we a leader amongst nations? Had other nations done it? How did that work out on an international perspective?
We were without question the leader in doing this, and that's something that has been widely adopted in other parts of the world. The three essential functions that the FAA does, essentially managing air traffic, providing a regulatory framework to ensure safety, and funding airport infrastructure, are very commonly the three functions in aviation in other parts of the world. There are different models about how they're done. In some cases, there's a much higher involvement of the private sector, say in air traffic control or in ownership and development of airports. But the structure that was put in place here under President Eisenhower's leadership has proved to be very durable, and it was widely adopted throughout the whole world.
And speaking of Eisenhower being ahead of the game, the article I'm not done with yet is about how tantalizingly close and unknown till now that Eisenhower came towards actually creating a cabinet-level Department of Transportation in 1959. And one of the two big reasons that it never came to fruition was that they had just gone through all this great work to create an independent FAA outside the Commerce Department a year prior. And the thought of going back to Congress and saying, well, now let's create a new department and move this independent FAA back under it was just going to be too much of a heavy lift. So we had to wait for Lyndon Johnson in 1966.
And when Lyndon Johnson created the Department of Transportation, there was another urban legend that he had to call up the FAA administrator to get things like office space and pencils and pens and erasers and all of that sort of stuff to get going.
I love it. Okay, we've got two more questions, and we could probably take this another hour, but we really did promise that we were going to not tie up your entire evening. But really, if you were to read the questions and answers, fully half of them are These two gentlemen are distinguished. They've given us so much information. Please, how do we find this? This entire event will be published on the Capitol Historical Society website and available for people. So if you're listening and you want to make sure somebody else, you will have the opportunity to share that. So as we wrap up, one of the questions is, was there any discussion in the creation of the interstate highway system or in the placement of airports that looked at the question about disruption of communities and what would be the responsibility for dealing with any disruption of communities?
On the highway side, this is a very tricky question. That 37,700 mile map that I showed you that was of the interstate that was negotiated by the states and the federal government in 1947 had several thousand miles of interstate throughways built into it, but they were too small to see on the map. And by 1955, when Eisenhower and everyone were looking at the map, unless you looked at the fine print in the big book in 1947, you didn't really see that these roads were going to be going, through cities. And there was also, it was known at the time that they were negotiating another 2,300 miles, I think, of beltways and spurs to go around, mostly around, but occasionally dead-ending into cities. Those were released in early October 1955. At that point, Eisenhower had his big heart attack on September 24th, was in the hospital in Colorado, and was basically incommunicado for about 3 months, didn't come back to DC until December. So in a big meeting in April 1960, Eisenhower declared that he didn't know that some of the urban through routes were going to be as disruptive as they were, because he'd never seen that book in fall 1955 that had been distributed to Congress while he had a heart attack. But once someone showed him the book and he said, this was on the desk of every congressman when they voted on the bill, and they said, yes, he says, well, that's it. Because Eisenhower always said that once, when his memory conflicted with the written record at the time, the written word was it. So by that point, they had decided that it was basically too late. The Bureau of Public Roads had always viewed roads going through cities as the whole point of the idea. And so that's how they wound up being selected.
On the airport side, the airport program was initially conceived and designed always to be in support of state and local entities. They would decide where to put it, and the federal government would support it. When the FAA was created, there was one airport that was in federal ownership, today's Reagan National Airport. And the federal government really only selected the location of one airport in the entire country, and that's today's Washington Dulles International Airport, which at the time it was located truly in the middle of nowhere, far away from communities, and that was the big criticism when it first opened, that it was too far from the city and in the middle of nowhere.
Wow. Okay, final question. Now we have congestion pricing, tolls. What do you think, Eisenhower? I understand that tolls were discussed and rejected for the original interstate highway system, but now we have some toll roads and we have congestion pricing. How do you think all that fits into Eisenhower's grand plan?
The roads constructed under the funding for the interstates provided by Eisenhower did not go to build toll roads, but the interstate system did incorporate some previously existing toll roads like the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which stayed toll. There were no new toll lanes built with taxpayer money until you had the dawn of high occupancy vehicle lanes that then could be converted to what they call hot lanes, high occupancy toll. There have been a few pilot programs established by Congress over the years that were going to allow an occasional conversion of existing reconstruction of existing interstate lanes to tolls, but they've had a real trouble finding states that were willing to take advantage of it. And so for the most part, and again, and occasionally now they can build new interstate lanes at state expense and allow those to be part of the interstate system. But the original $27 billion that Eisenhower provided that was then, it increased later on as cost increases went up for interstate construction, didn't go to toll roads. In fact, the ban all the way back in 1916, Congress passed a ban saying that if a road was built with federal aid highway dollars, it could never be tolled. And so that's, the ban didn't originate in 1956. The ban originated in 1916.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Secretary LaHood, for joining us, our distinguished members of Congress, the people you don't see behind the scenes, Cocoa Bee Productions, Layla Nielsen and Company, the staff of the United States Capitol Historical Society. Really was a collaborative effort to make this day come together. We're all learning things in this new virtual world, where how can we bring our members of Congress together with our interested parties and have a distinguished panel while everybody's in different places. And I really am grateful for everybody that, you know, just put their head to it and tried to make it work. So like all of our United States Capitol Historical Society programs, this one exists because of the members and the friends of the society who donate to make these things possible. Although we're chartered by Congress to tell the story, we are entirely privately funded. So if you enjoyed this effort, we hope you will become a member, increase your membership, encourage your friends to become members. The recording will be available within the next couple of days on our website. We're happy to share it. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thank you for your service to our country. We appreciate your joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.